Hey, it's me, Taffy. Why did I say that assuming you all know me? Over the past decade, it's been undeniable that comic characters have taken over mainstream media. Due to the success of the MCU and childhood cartoons, many people have become open fans of comic book characters, and more recently due to the rise of streaming, this has allowed for independent comic characters to also be adapted onto more mainstream mediums. You know, Spider-Man does funny dances, Homelander drinks milk, Hulk dabs, we all love it. A lot of people probably think that the people behind these stories are from the US due to the most well-known Western publishers being Marvel and DC. But the reality of this is that for the past few decades, comic book writers and artists tend to come from all over the world. And a lot of the iconic comic book stories and characters that you may know were written by British writers, like me. Civil War, Watchmen, All-Star Superman and The Boys were all written by Brits. However, one thing I've noticed as I've gotten a bit older is that many of the most well-known British comic book writers tend to be famous for their edgier works, and that tends to be their first major step into the mainstream comic book industry as well. This trait has been something that a lot of these writers have been praised for by using these darker stories to give new angles to these characters or the superhero medium in general, whilst other writers were criticized and dismissed for using dark imagery and gore only for shock value and just to be edgy. So I'm going to look through some of these writers' most popular and edgy comics to see if their edgy writing styles are good and worth your time reading, or just a cheap way to sell more books. Mark Millar has written some of the most popular Marvel comic titles in the past 20 years. He's probably most well known for his time writing for Marvel in the early to mid 2000s, where he wrote the original Civil War comic, which was later adapted by the MCU and became one of Marvel's most well-known stories. He also wrote Ultimate X-Men, which was a part of a massive universe reboot for Marvel at the time. He wrote Old Man Logan, a dark Elseworlds tale of Marvel in a post-superhero world, and a Wolverine run back in 2005. He's also collaborated with prolific artists such as John Romita Jr. and Frank Quitely to create original works such as Kick-Ass and Jupiter's Legacy. Millar is a writer who I've known the name of since I was pretty young, which should be a little concerning since his comics weren't exactly made for children. Whilst his stories are very well known, I've seen some criticisms where people have seen his work as just edgelord schlock with a ton of violence, and a lack of true depth or meaning. It's not that people see him as a bad writer, but that he doesn't choose to always create stories that aren't full of gore. His comics can posit interesting ideas and questions if he wants them to, but I can still see a lot of mixed opinions amongst readers. So for Mark Millar, I will look at his work on Old Man Logan, which is one of his most well-known stories for a pretty good reason. To me, Old Man Logan is low-key a modern classic. It's not peak fiction or anything, but it's a really easy and entertaining read, which I assume is the reason for its popularity. The story follows a post-apocalyptic world where most of Marvel's heroes have been slaughtered on the night the heroes fell. The only two we know that are alive are Wolverine and Hawkeye. However, unbeknown as to why, Logan has become a complete pacifist and swears to never pop his claws or to hurt another soul ever again. He's a farmer now and he has a whole family, and I wish I could say it was a wholesome time, but it really isn't. America has been completely reshaped, and many of the villains have now taken over different states and areas of the country, such as the West Coast being taken over by the Hulks. Logan's rent is due and his family haven't got the funds for it, so when the grandchildren of Bruce Banner arrive, they beat Logan to near death and demand double the amount next month. After they leave, that's when Hawkeye arrives with a quest for Logan to accompany him on a journey to the East Coast to deliver some cargo, which in turn will reward Logan with $500, more than enough to pay the rent and help the situation his family's in. If you've read this comic, then you'd know that there are a lot of crazy what-if scenarios and gore that takes place here. The world building in this series is probably its strongest point. We get to see the full deterioration of America as a place after the hero's death, but also the deterioration of some of the characters themselves that we've grown up knowing. Hawkeye is not the same as we once knew him at all. His morality has become disturbingly flexible in this series as he prioritizes status over doing the right thing. And after all the things that have happened over the past 50 years, in a world that seems this hopeless, where nobody cares about you anymore, can you really blame him? Millar also really digs deep into the idea of Hawkeye being the most useless Avenger. And whilst it kinda just starts off as a joke, we see how much this notion truly bothers Hawkeye, and how this yearning to be believed in and seen as purposeful leads to his death. Also, he's blind now. Logan is completely broken in this book. Everything we once knew about him has been turned on its head. Logan refuses to be called Wolverine. He refuses to pop his claws, he refuses to raise his voice, he refuses to fight back, and refuses to stand up for himself. The only thing that hasn't changed about him is his undying love for his family. We come to find out that Logan was one of the mass murderers who killed the superheroes, as he was being controlled by Mysterio. Mysterio made Wolverine see all his allies as villains, and Wolverine slaughtered them without hesitation. But when he was released from the illusion and saw what he'd done, it drove him to try and end it all. Logan has his healing factor though, and he healed, of course, but then vowed to never hurt another soul again. But this journey not only tests his patience and shows us how far the world has gone to hell after the mistake he made, but it also causes him to break his rule of not hurting anybody, but not enough to the point where he'll use his claws. Up until he returns home with more than enough money than he was offered to pay off the Hulk gang, but as he gets there, his family's gone. His neighbor tells him that the reason for the Hulk's killing them was because they got bored. As I mentioned earlier, the Hulk had taken over the West Coast, and this former Avenger has fallen to much darker depths than Clint Barton had. Banner has become a tyrant who has to compete with the other villains who own territory. So if someone doesn't pay their rent, or if someone shows disrespect to the Hulks, they die, painfully. The Hulks are also cannibals, I forgot to mention that they eat people. And the Hulk family was started by Bruce and She-Hulk, which means the Hulk gang are all inbred. Was there a need for this? Probably not. Just more gross shock for the reader, I guess. The rest of the Marvel characters also have their own strange dystopic twists to them. Kingpin is black like in the Daredevil 03 movie, but kinda reminds me more of Marcellus Wallace. Ultron is the stepfather to Hawkeye's daughter. I have no idea what the point of this was, and it's just strange. Also, Hawkeye's daughter is the granddaughter of Spider-Man, so her and her friends try to become a new age of superheroes. Psych, she's evil, and she even tries to kill her dad, but Logan jumps in and saves him. The president of this post-apocalyptic America, however, is none other than the Red Skull, who owns a trophy room full of the weapons, armor, and corpses of his dead enemies, his most prized possession being Captain America's costume, which Skull wears with pride as a symbol for his success. He's the one who set up the entire journey that Logan and Hawkeye went on, and is the reason for Hawkeye's death. So Logan avenges Hawkeye, leaving Red Skull to perish in the uniform of his greatest enemy. How poetic. Dr. Doom also shows up in one panel during the run, but doesn't really do anything. He's kinda just there aura maxing. So in the case of Old Man Logan, I would say this is one of the good ones. The story is definitely more of a horror/thriller than the classic action adventures that Marvel Comics tend to follow. Whilst there is a lot of shocking and gory imagery in this comic, it does have some depth to it. Like I mentioned earlier, the world building is really interesting, and Millar unravels the truth behind this world's fallout by weaving these revelations into the journey that Logan and Hawkeye go through. But then again, there's a lot of stuff in this comic which is just kinda there to be edgy, like the entire Hulk situation, for example. The whole incest baby reveal was clearly just thrown in there to make Banner seem even more vile as a villain, but it was pretty unnecessary if you ask me. Like, the cannibalism was already there and showed us how cruel the Hulk and his family were, and then they added on the thing with She-Hulk, and yeah, that was just overkill. Also, it's pretty much character assassination the way how Millar wrote Bruce Banner in this comic, because he's nothing like the Bruce we're used to. In his villainous monologue, he talks about how people claim that he'd lost it due to the gamma radiation frying his brain, but then immediately dismisses those accusations to being incorrect theories, and apparently this is just him being himself. So Bruce Banner is a completely different person here. Kinda like Superman in Injustice, except we don't get any proper satisfying explanation as to why he's like this now. He's just weird. Speaking of weird, let's get on to our next comic book writer. Garth Ennis. Boy, do I have some things to say about you. Garth Ennis is an Irish writer who mostly writes independent and original comic books. He's pretty much known for hating superheroes, and due to this, has created works that are so crude and at times nonsensical that it's kind of impossible to not be intrigued by them. His most notable comic is The Boys, which gained even more attention after the Amazon Prime series came out. I watched this series for the first time a few months ago, and whilst I did prefer it to the comic, I think that's kind of lost its way and has fallen into the same trap as its source material. Now, Ennis is capable of writing good stuff, I want to make this very clear, as he wrote Punisher Max, one of the character's most iconic comic runs, and he also wrote Preacher, which is well acclaimed by most people that I've seen talk about it. But The Boys is just a hate tribute towards superheroes in general. It spoofs popular superheroes and makes them the most vile, stuck-up, and idiotic characters that I've ever seen. And he does it all in a way to make it look like a serious series. The Boys might be the greatest example of rage bait of all time, I'm not even joking. But I'm exploiting that rage, so take that, Garth. I'm kinda kidding here, I really like your other work though, so don't hate me if you see this. This isn't the only time he's done this either. Just take a look at Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe. He clearly gets off on writing stuff like this. I mean, what is this? If you're a loose comic reader, then you've probably heard of the comics I've just mentioned, but in this video, I was going to look at one of Ennis's works he'd made for Image Comics called The Pro, which follows the story of a superpowered sex worker and her misadventures. But that comic is so freaky and vile that I either pixelate every panel that I show on here, or YouTube will drain me of my blood. So instead, I'm just going to talk about The Boys because that's probably what everybody wants anyways. superheroes. I won't go super in depth because again, YouTube will pack me up, but I'll explain the basis of the comic and how it reflects Ennis's view on superheroes. The Boys comic starts pretty similar to the Amazon series, where a young man named Huey horrifically loses his girlfriend in an accident caused by A-Train, a speedster who ran through Huey's girlfriend right in front of him. This allows for bad boy hero hater Billy Butcher to adopt Huey as his disciple in hero killing because in this universe, not only are all superheroes pretty much just celebrities, but they're also either super evil behind closed doors or disgusting freaks. Sometimes both. Most times both. In the series, we pretty much follow the boys as they go around blackmailing, toying with, and beating up superheroes. Starting with the stuff I like with the series, it's that hot take. I kind of prefer Billy Butcher in the comic to the show. I think he's less likable in the comic, which is why I prefer more to the show's version of the character. In the comic, Billy Butcher is made to be a dislikable guy right off the bat. He goes around terrorizing random people for no reason. He's horrible to his peers unless he needs to be nice to them as a form of manipulation, and he's extremely vulgar. He does have a few moments where he shows that he has a heart, but then again, they're very few. In the show, his darker nature gets toned down a bit, which definitely makes him easier to like as a character, but I feel like when everybody else is talking trash about him, I feel like it's a little overkill, especially after the later seasons when they know all the stuff he's been through, and his main issue is that he gets tunnel visioned when trying to kill Homelander. In the comic, he's pretty much just a prick who just wants all superheroes dead. Does he still want vengeance? Yes. Does it make sense for the character to want this? Of course, but that doesn't mean he can go around doing some of the stuff he does in the comic. My point is that I understand why his team has issues with him because he genuinely isn't a great person to work with. Structurally, the comic is also written decently well. Like I said earlier, Ennis isn't a bad writer. That isn't the picture I want to paint here at all. I'll express more later that it's just the content itself which I have issues with, but I think that Ennis paced the story quite well and introduced us to the characters and developed some of them pretty well. He also knows when and where to switch perspectives between the boys and the Seven, so on that note, he knows the structure of writing a story pretty well. Yeah, he used his Peel paragraph correctly. He just wrote a bunch of weird stuff in them, and that's what I don't like. Unfortunately, I don't have much else good to say about the Boys comic, so it's time for Everything Wrong with the Boys. 98% of the heroes are horrible, freaky people with pretty much no redeeming qualities. There's a lot of extreme violence which happens just for the hell of it. Homelander isn't an extremely layered villain and complex character, but just an overpowered idiot. Tech Knight almost does unspeakably horrible things to his underage sidekick. A literal Diddy party goes on within the first 10 issues of the comic. The plot twist is extremely stupid. The boys constantly use Compound V, which lowers the stakes of the series quite a bit. Billy Butcher's British accent is extremely hard to read in speech bubbles. You know, I'm starting to get the feeling that Garth Ennis doesn't like superheroes, but I wonder why that could be. Okay, so jokes aside, I can kinda see the appeal to the Boys comic. 14-year-old me probably would have eaten this up, but for a comic that seems to be an extremely critical commentary on the superhero genre and celebrity culture in general, I feel like it lacks evaluation. How are you going to secure that 20 marks without the AO3, you know what I'm saying? Other than Starlight, pretty much all the other heroes have nothing redeeming about them at all. That's something I really liked about the series. A lot of the supes are assholes and that's fine, but they're still written like people. They're not all bad, and some of them have traits about them that make them feel real. But when reading the Boys, they're pretty much all just horrible. After reading this, The Pro and Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe, I really just want to sit with Garth Ennis and have an honest chat with him to see what's going on in that brain of his. Like, not even for content, I just want to have a convo with him. On the odd chance he or someone he knows is watching this, let's make that happen, please. But that's enough of this, let's get to the segment that I'm personally most excited for. Alan Moore should need no introduction, but I'ma do it anyway. Alan Moore was one of the most well-known and skilled comic book writers of all time. His portfolio consists of stories that have completely redefined the comic book medium and are constantly listed in the top 10 best list of comic books and graphic novels.
Calling them graphic novels, which was a term that I hated.
He wrote From Hell, an independent comic focusing on the serial killer Jack the Ripper. He wrote V for Vendetta, a comic expressing his beliefs of anarchism, which then inspired the real-life usage of the Anonymous/Guy Fawkes mask in real protests. He also wrote The Killing Joke, a comic which deconstructs the Joker's character and left irreversible changes to Batman's lore and iconic panels, such as Batman and the Joker laughing together. But arguably his most iconic and original creation was the story for the original Watchmen comic, one of the most influential comics to date and a favorite amongst many people who don't even like comics in general. This man did not miss, but if you notice that I used past tense verbs in describing him at the beginning of the introduction, no, that wasn't a typo, because Alan Moore has since retired from writing comics and disowned a lot of his work such as Watchmen and The Killing Joke. Moore is pretty big on artistic integrity, and he pretty much has disowned all the comics which he believes have been sellouts, I guess. He also believes in magic, and that his ability to sway beliefs in people's perspectives through his writing is a form of magic. Now, I know this sounds a little cuckoo, and considering the fact that Moore used to do a lot of psychedelics, he may be a little bit geeked. However, people are entitled to their beliefs, and his stories are super influential and have changed the course of how comics are made and received by people, even making them more acceptable to be read amongst adults. So with all that being said, I struggled to decide which comic I should look at to try and understand Moore's style, since he has so many great titles which all have massive cultural impacts. But it's got to be Watchmen. Come on. I don't want to repeat what the rest of the internet has said, but you know, everyone and their mums made a video on Watchmen, so we'll see how that goes. Watchmen is pretty much the OG superhero comic to do the whole realistic and cynical approach to superheroes. However, it shows much more variety in its depiction of superheroes than just P. Diddy's with powers. There are villains in disguise like the Comedian, the anti-hero Rorschach, the goody two-shoesers like the Night Owl, and the overpowered god Dr. Manhattan. The comic starts as a murder mystery following the death of the Comedian, who I can probably describe as notorious amongst his peers. Moore uses a lot of flashbacks to help us uncover the characters and let us know who they are and why they're in the current state they're in after the Comedian's death. I think what really hits home with this series is that it's deeply nuanced in its depiction of superheroes. They aren't all horrible assholes, but just flawed people. And while some try to do what they can to help, others just don't care. Oddly enough, there's a flashback scene that mirrors Starlight's introduction in The Boys, where the Comedian almost essays a female superhero, but in The Boys, the two heroes that walk in end up joining. But in Watchmen, the Comedian is stopped by Hooded Justice, who isn't depicted as a chivalrous savior, but another person in the business who at least has the right state of mind to stop such a horrible thing from taking place. The world of Watchmen is similarly sad and hopeless to The Boys in a lot of ways. Riots constantly take place. There's a lot of homelessness and prostitution, and due to the comic being serialized from 1986 to 87, there is a ton of influence from the Cold War in this story. The characters in Watchmen are deeply layered and aren't just edgy to try and gain buzz. Its edginess is a reflection of Moore's belief of anarchism and evaluates how dark the world can actually be, even if there's superheroes running around. Issue 4 is one of the best pieces of fiction that I think I've ever consumed. It's an existential rollercoaster showing us what life is like for Dr. Manhattan, being constantly in the past, present, and future simultaneously, and being the most powerful entity known on the planet. And the sad truth that he's essentially the US's walking H-bomb. The Comedian is a terrible person, and it's all because of his nihilistic apathy to the world. He doesn't care about life, other people, or society. Literally everything is a joke to him. But he's still human, which means he has moments of weakness. He breaks down and gets so scared to the point where he's prays to God in front of one of his enemies, which makes you question if that 6 smile he always puts on is more of a mask than the domino that he wears. Laurie, the second Silk Spectre, is the predecessor to her mother, who is the original. Her story feels painfully relatable in a lot of ways, since she's got to try and figure out life for real now. She was brought into the superhero life when she was only 16, and when it got outlawed, she was given the liberty to stay with Manhattan and not have to go and find a new career. But after she leaves him, now she has to go out into the world and find out what she's going to do. Her whole life has always been tied to superheroes. Her mother was a hero before her, and everybody she knows is or was a damn superhero. While she's perfectly able to go solo and do her own thing, it's that confusion and fog that's in between her, which is slowing her down from finding herself a new path. And then there's Rorschach. Look, this guy has been talked about to death on YouTube already, so it will feel even more redundant to talk about him than the comic itself. He's the most popular character and probably the most edgy all around. You know, come to think of it, maybe that's why he is so popular. Huh. Watchmen is regarded to be one of the greatest graphic novels of all time, which I won't argue against. It's an extremely thought-provoking, cinematic, and tear-jerking piece of art. It's not exactly a fun read, but it definitely hooks you in, and you really get the idea that the characters at the beginning of the story are all stuck in the same position of being slightly lost. I don't really want to get into the ending of it because it's one of those things where I would like to make a video exclusively on Watchmen and talk about it. And also, if you haven't seen it, then you should definitely experience it properly for yourself, not by listening to a talking cardboard cutout talk about it, you know? But just know that Watchmen is considered a classic for a very good reason. So what have we learned today? That the UK is full of writers who have never experienced happiness or sunshine? No. Well, maybe the second part is true, but other than that, I only looked at 3 of the biggest UK writers that have come out of the comic book industry. But I don't think the pattern is that they're from the UK and that all Brits are into depressingly edgy stuff. I think the fact that these are some of the stories that got these guys' names heard is a bigger reflection of the audience in the industry rather than the writers themselves. Okay, let me cook. Alan Moore is known as the first DC comic writer to work out of Britain, and that clearly is because there are a lot of capable and great writers in the US. So to get to this position, Moore stood out more amongst the other competition due to his very unique writing topics. Camp was everywhere in the 1980s, so by subverting that, I'm sure that caught the editor's eyes at DC. However, I don't think that it was intentionally done by Moore, as like I said earlier, he's really big on artistic integrity. So I'm sure he was just focused on telling the stories that interested him the most, which happens to be what interested the rest of the world by the looks of it. Similarly, of course Garth Ennis caught the attention of readers. When The Boys' first trailer was released, it was a huge talking point for how different it was to the MCU. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that the same thing probably happened with the comic. And Mark Millar, as I said, does follow a similar path with his storytelling by not shying away from gore and mature topics. Millar's first comic for Marvel was Ultimate X-Men, which isn't a perfect run for sure, but a comic that did what it had to so it could appeal to the early 2000s audience. So of course that means edginess is going to be involved. As you've seen, his work has gotten more edgy when Marvel has allowed for it to be, and his independent work gets even more crazy than that, and the people have been eating that stuff up. Mark Millar has a lot of hits, and a video of him would be pretty fire. I'll just add it to the list of videos I say I'll make, but most likely won't. Well, I guess that does it. Thanks for watching the video. I promise you, British people aren't all monster drinking edgelords. We're normal. For the most part. There were some other writers that I wanted to talk about, but I didn't want to burn out on this video since the last time I made was an hour long. If you haven't seen it, watch it, please. But if this video does well, then I'll consider doing a part 2 with those writers that I didn't talk about here. So yeah, subscribe if you haven't, prettiest of pleases, and join my Discord server to yap, get updates, and watch me make videos, and watch some more videos I made. Go on, you deserve it. Okay, that's it from me. See you next time, chumps.